Welcome to Agenda. Like I did tell you, today we're discussing the funding of political parties and the Freedom of Information bills. We want to find out exactly how these impact on the fight against corruption. But let me first introduce my guests for today. With me to my immediate left, Professor Justice Bawley. Professor Bawley is the head of Department of Public Administration and Health Services Management, University of Ghana Business School. And then next to him, I have Dr. Eric Odro-Osai. Dr. Eric Odro-Osai is a governance expert. And next to Dr. Osai, I have Dr. Rashid Draman. Dr. Rashid Draman is the Executive Director of the African Center for Parliamentary Affairs. Gentlemen, it's great to have you all on Agenda to discuss a very important topic of this nation. I'd like to start with you, Professor Justice Bawley. We have the usual corruption perception indices coming out very often, and Ghana's score for 2017, Ghana ranked 81 in the corruption index. Is this a cause for concern? I'd like to take views from all of you before we start talking mainly about the funding of political parties. Ghana's score on the CPI, is it a cause for concern?
Thank you and good afternoon to you, Cherry viewers. May I just take the opportunity to say hi to my friends in Pikra in the Garu Timpani district, where I just came back. They are celebrating the Danjo festival, and the chief is my friend, so I want to take advantage to greet Chief Naba Dasur. It's a cause for concern. Why not? If we were to play the league, join the league, or say football World Cup, and we did well, we are ranked best, we rejoice. But when you get ranked on issues of corruption and you are deteriorating year in, year out, then it should be a cause of concern, especially for this year, where we have dropped 3 steps below what we have done in the past. It's a cause for concern. But of course, those of us who have watched the political landscape would understand that this is not to be surprising, because there were signs that this would happen. If you remember when we started, this government started talking about a lot of things that they thought had happened in the past regime. In one of your shows, I indicated that governments are given power to deal with issues. And so if you came in and there were issues that you thought were illegal, people had done wrong, you need to deal with it because you have power. But when you came out and start polluting the environment with a lot more of things that you want us to know, and there was nothing being done, of course the perception of people would go up. And so you would get a lot more people expressing frustration.
Right. Dr. Draman, I'd like you to also tell me whether you feel that this rising indices of perception, 81 for 2017, I know we shouldn't be smiling about it, but other countries have performed worse. Should we be concerned extremely, like Professor Justice Bawley says?
Yeah, thank you very much, and good afternoon to all your viewers. I think it's, for me, perhaps maybe instead of looking at, we ranked 81 out of I don't know how many countries. Perhaps we should look at our percentage score, which is 40%. I've heard people say that, if you rank above 40, as we have done over the last couple of years, then we have a pass mark. And if you go 40 and below, it's almost like you have failed. I think consistently, our country has not done well. I've heard people commenting on there were golden years when we were at about 47 and so on. There are African countries that have scored 60 and above. And I don't think that these countries are better than our country in terms of capacity, in terms of human resource, and so on. The only difference, I think, in some of those countries like Rwanda, Botswana, Cape Verde, and so on, I think is simply political leadership and consistent commitment to fighting corruption, not just words.
Consistent commitment.
Because I think in this country we are very good at using words. Leaders who come out and make very beautiful statements, but when it comes to making sure that whatever reform processes we have in place are implemented, then our leaders begin to fall short. And I think that that is what has resulted in the kind of scores that we see year in, year out. If you look at our record in the last maybe 15, 20 years, I don't think anybody should celebrate.
Dr. Odurosai.
I think I share in the same, I share with them. I mean, the concern that we shouldn't be celebrating at all, especially if you look at our performance since 2012. Since 2012, in 2012 we were 45%, we scored 64th. 2013, 46%. So it seems to me that we've not gone past 50% as a country, and that is a source of worry. And most especially, looking at the number of countries this year, out of 180, we scored 81. We were 81st. It's not the best of things. It's a perception issue. So what we need to do is to deal with it, and that requires proactiveness on the part of government and all of us. We should ask ourselves, so what do we do? Because to score 40% in any examinations is total failure. Total failure. And to say that since 2012, as a country, we've not gone past 50%, it's a shame to all of us. It is a shame. We can't continue to pride ourselves that we are the beacon of democracy. Within democracy and good governance requires that corruption must be minimized. So I think it's a source of worry. We should deal with this canker here and now.
Deal with it here and now. Professor Justice Bawale, I'll come to you, but before I do that, I'll quickly want to quote the statements of Dr. Kweju Afari-Gyan during the Nationwide Consultative Forum on Financing Political Parties and the Electoral Process in 2003, and then and that from President Kufuor as well, to foreground our discussion on funding of political parties. Dr. Afari-Gyan says the problem of parties' inability to muster adequate resources to operate effectively must be a collective worry for us all, and not a challenge to the individual parties alone. That's Dr. Afari-Gyan. And then former President Kufuor also said, to me, the issue of public funding for political parties is more than making budgetary allocation to political parties. Neither is it about winning elections. It is about strengthening the main pillars of democratic governance and rule of law to secure the future of the country, unquote, former President Kufuor. Professor Justice Bawale, I purposely read this to foreground our discussion on funding political parties. Is there a link between funding of political parties to what appears to be corruption ingrained in our governance system?
Well, I'll give
or
you
in our political structure.
Yes, I'll
maybe.
give you something that may be unconventional. I disagree that we don't fund political parties.
We don't have a law that directs how to fund political parties.
Ask me where political parties get their money from, and I'll tell you they get it from the state, only through the back door.
Thievery.
Yes, so all over the year, over the years, we have funded political parties. That is why you see the party out of government, which has no direct access to state resources, getting weaker and weaker, and the party in
totally
government
crumbling.
does. Yes. So what we have done in the past is to fund political parties through the back door, and this back door is access only to the party in government. And so the party in government gets to establish itself, build structures, build, university or whatever, build their offices across the country, make their officers, rich. I told you I was coming today, and everywhere yesterday that you had these elections going on, you had the kind of passion with which people contested for positions. Why would they do that? Because there is a certain
even fainted or
exactly
because they lost.
So there's a certain direct access to the state pairs with the party that is in government.
Is it just a perception? Or
it's not. Sorry, it's
reality?
not. It's a reality. It's not. I mean, I don't, let me tell you, my student called me and asked me to come and contest for a parliamentary seat, and I said, I don't want. He said, and yeah, over the V8, in English, he says, if you are not coming to contest as a parliamentary candidate, it will take you ages to lie in to drive a V8. So there's not a perception. There's a clear direct link between political party and access to state resources. I pity those that have not had the opportunity to be in government. But even then, you would see, if you were to analyze critically, you see a certain connection. So parties that are not in government would align with the party in government. Then through the back door, they get funded somehow. Their officers get vehicles, their officers get paid, they get contracts in ways that allow them to also survive. And that is why, even though they don't get to be in power, and you don't know where they get their resources from, and we'll be looking at where the parties can get their resources from, they still are active in there, especially during campaign time when they know that they can play into and get their resources from. They still are active in there, especially during campaign time when they know that they can play into the game and get access to resources. So over the years, we have not legalized access transfer to political parties, but there has been direct access, transfer of our resources to political parties, and that is why you see that kind of interest happening in there.
Dr. Rashid Rama, I know that your group has been championing for what I will call regularizing the funding of political parties. I'm using that expression based on Professor Justice Barley's assertion that we appear to be funding political parties through the back door. What would you say should be done, one, to make sure that this back door is closed?
Thank you very much. I think this is really worrying, and for me, as someone who works very closely with parliaments, not only here in our country but across the continent, there is something we call the legislator's dilemma, that whenever a member of parliament is face to face with a policy issue or a law or raising his or her hand to vote or to make any decision at all in the House, they are confronted with the issue of who do they truly represent. Do they represent the people who send them to Parliament? Do they represent themselves? Do they represent country? Do they represent party? And so on. And I think it's been demonstrated consistently that in most instances, I think the parties hold sway. The parties have a very big stranglehold on these members of parliament, mainly because, like the Prof said, parties get funded by the state, but through the back door. And so you have, in most instances, we see that our politics is simply zero-sum. I mean, the party that wins, the executive controls all the resources, and through that, those resources are used to fund political campaigns and to fund political activities. And then you have representatives coming into the House, and instead of making decisions that are in the interest of you and I know we've been talking about corruption. The reason, one of the reasons why we have, prevalence of corruption and so on, is mainly because of some of these things.
Dr. Osai, the CDD's reports suggest that cost of running successful campaigns for members of parliament has risen by 59% over the past 4 years period, covering 2 national elections. And they say that each member of parliament spends about 390,000 Ghana cedis on average to campaign. These statistics are a bit disturbing. So do you get the impression that it's like the MPs, the politicians, those contesting elections at constituencies and national levels, they have actually institutionalized corruption as a result of the heavy demand, financial demand on them to win?
I would not subscribe to that. I don't have the evidence to suggest that. But what I think is happening in our country is that we've not paid attention to funding political parties and then funding of people contesting for political offices. We've left that particular bit very loose.
But they get their funding.
They get their funding. I'm coming there, and nobody seems to be concerned about where they get their money from. For instance, there is no provision in the Political Parties Act that requires an independent candidate or a parliamentary candidate to disclose the sources where they get their money to finance their political parties or their activities. And when it comes to funding political parties, please let us look at the political party as an institution, the activities of the political party, independent candidates, as well as parliamentary candidates and other persons standing for elective offices. when you go to other countries, it is clear that they have state funding for political parties. You go to Guatemala, you go to Australia, they have state funding of political parties. But once the state puts money into the activities of a political party, the state auditor would have to audit that political party. Morocco, it is done. When you come to Ghana, in other countries, they have what we call a mixed model. The state will give you some funding. You also have to generate some funding from somewhere. But once the state puts in a pesewa or a dollar...
But is state funding the right approach? Is it the way to cut this excessive corruption we see?
Definitely it is, because people are now seeing funding political parties and being in politics as an investment. To the extent that people go to borrow money from banks, people sell their houses, so they put it into the activities of political parties. When the party wins elections, they expect to recoup, and you have to give them contracts. Whether they are qualified or not, you have to find a way of compensating them.
Whether these contracts will be fairly executed or
that is the other side of it. So I think that I would agree with the other panel members that let us institutionalize it, but then it shouldn't be only political parties. Let us look at what happens to the funding of the activities of all persons standing for elective positions in Ghana, including that of parliamentarians and even assembly members. And I can tell you that if we don't regularize that bit, if we don't legislate it, if we don't find a way of funding it, then we should forget about corruption. Because whether we like it or not, people are seeing it as investment. And in our laws, we've made political parties to register as companies limited by guarantees. So let us ask ourselves, who are the founders of these political parties? What are their obligations? What do they bring to bear in it? Under the Political Parties Act, both Section 14 and 21 requires for political parties to file their accounts, indicate their sources of funds with the Electoral Commission. I have two problems with that. But the
political parties flout this directive every now.
Aside from flouting it, even if they file it, what is the capacity of the Electoral Commission to peruse further? What kinds of mandate, what kind of powers have we given to the Electoral Commission? In other countries, they are asked to file it, and when you file it, you don't give it to the Electoral Commission. You give it to the Auditor General. Then the Auditor General will follow up. So I think the systems are a little bit loose. What we need to do is to regularize it, institutionalize it. State funding for political parties is the way to go, and that will give the state access to the accounts and assets and liabilities of the political parties and be able to manage the corruption perception bit about electoral officers.
You know, yeah, I mean, just maybe to add to this a little bit, I've been talking to a number of senior members of our parliament, and usually, I mean, it's very interesting. When they are in opposition, they are very keen on tackling corruption and getting funding for political campaign and so on.
And they promise it a lot.
And they promise it a lot. They complain, for instance, before the last election, I was in conversations with some of the leaders thinking about, do we really, have to think about coming up with a bill that will look at, this funding of our political party. And one of the senior members remarked that, look, Doc, if we don't do that, one day we'll wake up and drug dealers will take over this country. Because he says, most of us, you don't know how we get our monies to run our campaign. Yes, some of the money comes from the state, but I can tell you there are a lot of interest groups. And I think that this is not only peculiar to our country. Look at what's happening in the U.S. right now. I don't know whether you've been following the news, but today I think a lot of companies have come up to severe relationships with the NRA. And students are on the streets saying that, the reason why...
Well, the government keeps supporting NRA because it's received over $3 million from the NRA over the last election.
That is a country where their election process is not in disarray as we have here. Look at what's happening in our electoral commission right now. As Doc said, there are laws, regulations in our laws about, filing your returns and so on and so forth.
At least 6 months after election.
I think the question we need to ask is, why is it that consistently over the years this has not been done?
And the Electoral Commission does nothing about it.
Does nothing. And you quoted Dr. Farijan. I'll be happy to ask him, when he was Electoral Commissioner, what did he do to make sure that, yes, the law as we have it now has its own limitations, but I believe that there were a number of things that could have been done at least to bring sanity to the processes.
Professor Justice Bawuli, I will ask you a futuristic question. What would be the ideal political system in Ghana?
In terms of funding political parties?
No, in terms of the structure that will make us have a political party system that is devoid of corruption, a political party system perhaps that is funded by the state, you know, so that we wake up every morning, we go to work and we don't worry about corruption.
Well, I think this is a question. This is a $1 million question, but I wish that it was possible to put it in a simulation environment. And do some permutations and simulate it on the computer to give us some outcomes, so that we will watch it and smile. Because, and why I say that is that the Ghanaian is so complex that if you were to put it in that kind of simulation environment, you may probably get a jammed system. And that is what we are likely to do as we want to project into the future. But I think practically what we need to do as a people is to begin to ask ourselves the question like that we have said. Who do we want to be in governance?
Who do we want as a member of parliament?
Yes, as a member of parliament. What kind of person must that person be?
In terms of his qualification
or his whatever, experience, everything. And also that what kind of person is he? In other words, if I were here and I didn't have the resources, but my people felt that I could be a good parliamentary candidate, will I be able to get into the race and win?
Would you win when you're a poor person?
You won't. That's the truth. You won't win. And that is why I say we need to be able to ask that question about who do we want to become a member of parliament. Is it that person who can finance the system and make sure he gets in there, or somebody who has the commitment, the passion, and the zeal to want to put himself up there? And I say we are complex and we would have difficulties in a simulation environment is because even the people who think that politicians should not be corrupt are themselves the people who make the politician corrupt. So it is difficult for us to stare out and say we are looking to get a political system that is not corrupt, because those of us who are expecting are the ones that make them corrupt are there. So I'm looking to see us say that, look, if this is the criteria we want, such that we can get a secondary school leaver or a fresh university graduate who has the passion and wants to go serve his people to become. Then the question will be, how do we ensure that such people are able to win the elections? And so then we will begin to take actions to remove the impediment that will make anybody who was not rich from getting in there. And that will not just be for us to remove people who are not rich, but also to remove the systems that exist to make somebody who was not rich to still be able to get rich and to finance themselves.
But would that not affect the quality of representation? I mean, Dr. Rashid Rama, I will come to you to tell me that anyway. But if we put through all these systems you're talking about, some kind of a screening system will now surface where those who go will be naturally qualified, but then they won't have the funding to get there also.
Well, that brings another element. Elsewhere, people who join the political race are not just people who feel they have passion and all of that, but these are people who have accomplished and think that they want to now serve. So if I'm a fresh graduate and I think I need to make money, and like our president said when he came into office, if you want to make money, go to the private sector. And if I'm a fresh graduate and I think that I want to make money and I don't think I want to serve pro bono now, then I know where to go. Otherwise, I want to join with the idea that, well, I feel that I should join and serve people. So a system that would require us to be able to clearly indicate who it is that qualifies. And if we think that we want anybody at all who has passion to go there and survive, then the state will ask the question, what does it take for that person to get there? And the state will provide what it is that takes that person there. Otherwise, as it is now, we would get people who can scheme us around, either by lying to us and we buy it and they don't have money to get there, or by being able to use the network that they have. And as he said, if I have friends who are coming from elsewhere and they want to champion a particular cause and they intend to fund me to make sure I go there and champion that cause for them, they will fund me. And so we need to be able to think through this carefully in a way that allows us to be able to say who it is that gets into our political space.
Dr. Rashid Ramani, I know that the CDD report indicates that as the cost for winning election keeps going up, competencies now take a back seat. Do you get the impression that it's already happening in our political system, that we're getting a lot of less competent people into parliament because they have the capacity to pay their way through whether or not they qualify?
Maybe I wouldn't say we are getting a lot of less competent people. Because if you look at the the caliber of members of parliament we have today in terms of qualification on paper,
it's been getting better.
Yes, and you compare it to about maybe 10, 15 years ago, it is better today.
We're getting more smart.
Yeah, we are getting exactly
more, but with the ability to.
But maybe
manipulate things.
Yes, maybe it is because the smarter people have found ways of getting funded to run for political.
But we don't know how they get.
Yes, we don't know how they get funded. And for me, I think, going back to your question in terms of what kind of political system should we have, I think that the day we get to a point where people know that when you go to parliament to go and serve, you are doing public service. You are not going there. Look, we described what is happening in our parliament as a kind of big waiting room for political appointment. If you go into that house today, 275 members, if they will be true to themselves, I think a huge majority of them went into that house not because they wanted to serve or they wanted to make a career as legislators. They went there because our political structure, our constitution, allows the president to take ministers, members of his executive out of parliament. A huge majority of them use that as a stepping stone to executive appointment, not because they really want to go and serve as members of parliament. And that is the beginning of the problem.
Beginning of the problem.
Yes, that's the beginning of the problem. And then when you come down to the cost, as you made reference to the CDD study, it was actually a study that was done jointly by CDD and the Westminster Foundation.
Yes.
For democracy. Beyond the cost, I think if you look at the length of time that we use in this country for political campaign, in some countries like in Canada and the UK, campaign period is about maybe less than 2 months. But you come to this country, I think somebody described our campaign period as maybe immediately the one election is over, the campaign period has started. And the cost is huge. And then when you have people investing, like Doc here said, some people even sell their properties.
Yeah.
Members of parliament, I know, have said over and over, we have taken loans to run elections. Why would you go and take a loan to run for office when you are going to do public service? I think these are the key questions that we need to start integrating. Until maybe let me just wrap up. Until we get to a situation where we have very serious, committed leadership that is consistently dealing with corruption, we are going to continue to see this, because people will go in there and then they flout the rules, knowing that they can recoup their resources. In some countries, you cannot do this. In Rwanda, you cannot do this.
Dr. Odorosan, you're sitting in between the two gentlemen who have made strong points, so you carry the day. So what do you think?
I think that in the absence of national standards and qualifications for a requirement for running or putting yourself up for a public office, a public election would produce the most popular person, not the most competent person. And to such a time that we develop our systems in such a way that the system will be able to produce the most competent person who is prepared to serve and not to be served, then we are not there yet. And to be able to get there, we need Africa type of democracy.
What is the Africa type?
The Africa type of democracy is
one person stay in power 20 years.
That is not it. The Africa type of democracy is a democracy laced with good traditional systems. I can tell you that in countries that have blended the Western democratic type with their traditional systems.
Which example do you have in mind?
I have an example of Morocco. In fact, that is where I have just visited for 1 week. And I can tell you that in Morocco, it is obligatory for political parties to publish their financial statement audited by the Auditor General. If you don't know and your source of funding comes from any of the illicit sources, that's the end of you. And they have 2 chambers, and the king is so much respected that even when parliamentarians have passed the law and he sees political biasness in the law, the second chamber can quash the law for the purpose of national interest. I think we have copied blindly. Because in a country where illiteracy rate is very high, people cannot read immediately. People do not understand some of the things we do. The best for us is to come up with an African type of democracy. We say Rwanda is doing well, Rwanda is doing well. Why is Rwanda doing well? Rwanda is doing well because they have stable political systems. They have a good leader who puts the interest of the nation as the best in everything that he does.
He has an agenda.
He has an agenda. Well, he's pursuing it. But what I'm saying is that we have copied blindly. So at such a time that we develop an electoral system that produces the most competent person prepared to serve, and not necessarily the most popular person who has come to power or who is prepared to lead, by all means, then we are in trouble.
We're in trouble indeed. This is still Agenda. I'm Stephen Antia. We're discussing corruption, tackling corruption from the perspective of the funding of political parties and the right to information. Let's go back and listen to Franklin Cudjoe, who is actually against the funding of political parties. Because before we switch to the right to information, Franklin Cudjoe is president of Imani Africa.
We only have a flagging democracy, but in terms of real value-enhancing democracy, what have we got? There's a lot of policy incoherence. People are doing things by themselves. You don't see any proper coordination. If we open the floodgates and allow many more people to create political parties, that will spell doom for our finances in this country. In fact, it will become a lifestyle and a source of employment. We don't want that.
Let's go back and hear from Dr. Kwesi Jonah, who is a senior research fellow at IDEC, also spoke on funding for political parties.
Very many developed democracies in the world, parties are funded. And the reason parties are funded is that in almost every democracy, we need the parties to perform certain public functions, to shape public opinion, to offer alternative policies, and so on and so forth. So what you want to do is to provide a certain funding to support the functions that you want the parties to perform in a democracy.
Right. Professor Justice Bali, we had Dr. Jonah and Franklin Cudjoe. Yeah. Franklin's point, which stuck to my mind, is that when the state funds political parties, we get more political parties. Should we be worried about that too?
No, I don't think it's correct. Probably not entirely the case that if we fund, we get more. Otherwise, we should get more lecturers because we pay lecturers, right? Otherwise, we should get more MPs because
you're saying that you pay lecturers and you get more lecturers, but there are systems regulating.
Yes, so of course,
who is employed as a lecturer.
So what it means is I'm not sure as a country we are just going to say the next day let everybody come, any party come get money. I'm sure there are going to be systems, but he made a point that, in my view, defeats the point that he made. The fact that we have policy incoherence, very bad policies coming out. And the very reason why we have that is actually the fact that the political parties are not coordinated. The political party sets up, and because they get money from wherever they have to get, they use the money to do what they consider as most important. If the state decides to fund political parties, what we would do is to direct, one, what the money would come from and where it would go. Elsewhere, for example, there is what is known as the policy development grant. So a political party that meets a certain criteria is given money to develop alternative policy. So you tell us that we are going to do this workshop one, or you are going to get a consultant to do this, or your team is going to do X, Y, to come out with, for example, alternative policies to free SHS. And the state provides the money for you to come out with that policy. So the state directs what you can do based on what money they are giving you. The other has to do with the fact that because the state does not provide funding, it is difficult to dictate who the state actually employs at its, the party actually employs at its staff. If the state would fund political parties, for example, pay staff of political parties, the state will put the criteria, who qualifies to become a party general secretary, for example, and what qualification they must have and what they should be doing. So the state would have a job description for political parties, functionaries.
So funding them doesn't mean blanket formation
no,
of XYZ political party, YYY political party.
I think so.
Dr. Odros, I'll change the discussion to the bit about the right of information. To what extent would a right of information law help in the fight against corruption? I'm happy you're a lawyer too, though.
Thank you very much. The right to information is guaranteed in the Constitution, and information is critical. If information comes late, it's useless. And if you want to fight against corruption, then people should have impeccable information. That is why we have security and intelligence. The intelligence system feeds on information for the security to act. If you don't have credible information, you can't fight corruption. And I can tell you that you can decide to suspect.
But you just mentioned that the right is enshrined in the Constitution.
Yes, in the Constitution.
If that is guaranteed in the Constitution. Why do we need the right to information bill
Let
or
me
law?
explain. If the Constitution makes a generic provision, you require an enabling act to operationalize the specifics of the provisions in the Constitution. That is why we need a Right to Information Act. But I don't know what the fear of some people are. Because if you pass the Right to Information bill into an act today, people can have an unrestricted access to credible information that can help in fight against corruption. And they can use legitimate means. But I think they are preventing people from getting it. And you see, if you prevent people from having access to information, they try to script the agenda by coming up with their own information. We tried closing the gap by passing a Whistleblowers Act, so that people who have some impression or a sense of some corrupt activities can blow their whistle. Ask yourself, to what extent have we even sensitized people?
How many people blow the whistle anyway?
And if you blow the whistle, what is the guarantee? What's the security that you will not be exposed? You know, so it is not all about passing the act. But if you pass the act and you fail to put in place systems to ensure that you can get this information and use it well, we are going to be in trouble. But I must tell you that it is long overdue, and with a country that prides itself with its democratic credentials.
It's a shame.
It's a shame. No wonder we've not gone past 50% in the CPI since 2012.
Dr. Rashid Romani, I know that your parliamentary center, your center has been doing quite a lot of lobbying to get to make sure that we have a right to information law. What is your position, seeing the state of lack of, right to information in our country now?
Thank you very much. I think, certainly it's very long overdue. I think this has been in Parliament close to about a decade and a half, about 15 years now.
Does it surprise you?
It doesn't surprise me. It doesn't surprise me because we are a country, of course, that lives on past glory. We are always very quick to say we're first to do this, first to do that. But when you push and scrutinize closely, I think we are just simply living on past glory. What I want to say about this right to information is simply that, research has shown that just simply having the right to information law doesn't reduce corruption.
What does it do then?
In fact, research is even showing that having the right to information laws, sometimes, particularly if you don't pay attention to certain key provisions of that law, corruption goes up. For instance, people who have to provide the information have a lot of discretion. And when you have people with a lot of discretion and that is not controlled, then you have a situation where they will decide when they have to give you the information. So for instance, in England, there is research that has shown that, in fact, it takes, I think, about 2 or 3 months before people get information when they request for it. As a result, it has created a huge backlog.
Meanwhile, the law says 30 days.
Exactly. And then, if you go to India, research has also shown that what is really happening is that people actually go and bribe in order to get information. So, the mere existence of that law doesn't reduce corruption. It rather particularly when the human element and the discretion is not properly controlled.
That's very interesting. So what would be your suggestion then?
Well, I think what would be my suggestion is that, look, when we have this law, I think the provisions must be provisions that are very strict, that are very clear, and then we have to ensure that, you know, those provisions are respected. And anyone who flouts any of those provisions would have him or herself to blame in terms of breaking the law of the land.
Do you get the impression that it is these, I'll call them blind spots, that is making it pretty difficult for successive governments to pass the right to information?
No, I don't think our members of parliament and our public officials are very much aware of this research that I'm making reference to. I think simply, I mean, observing Parliament and observing how things play out there, I think the two parties have failed us over the years because I think they are living in fear that once this law is passed, I mean, it's going to open the Pandora's box. It's going to expose a lot of things that they would otherwise want to keep under wraps. So
do you think, are these fears based on suspicions, or you think they're well informed?
Well, I mean, these fears are, I mean, certainly based on partly on suspicion, partly grounded, because I have seen some countries also, despite the fact that, you know, research is showing lack of clear correlation between, corruption levels and the freedom of information law. I mean, I have seen a country, I lived in Canada for many years, and when I was a student in Canada, journalists in Canada used the freedom of information law to bring about a government. Because they wrote on that law, there was a scandal at the time, and using that law, they were able to obtain information. And of course, I mean, in Canada, there are strict limits in terms of, I mean, if you are requested to provide information, you don't have the latitude to decide when to provide the information and, I mean, play delaying tactics and so on. Journalists from the Globe and Mail, the leading newspaper in Canada, use the freedom of information law to extract information from civil servants. And then Parliament picked up the issue. It went to the Public Accounts Committee. Officials came and they were contradicting each other from what, I mean, information was available through the work of investigative journalists. And that led to a very big election, and the Liberals at the time lost their majority in Parliament and lost power. So, so the point here is that, you know, just simply having the law is
it's not enough.
It's not enough. I think you people would also have to play a very important role, and I think there are concerns about how you people practice your profession, because many people believe that we cannot simply rely on you because
we don't get credible information.
Exactly, and then most of you are also not credible. I'm very sorry to say,
very
sorry to see this on this platform. I think we need a combination of many factors in order to make whatever law that we are going to eventually have to work.
Professor Justice Bawley, freedom of information. Should we even bother about freedom of information, considering that there is already a guarantee for, right of information, considering that there is already a constitutional guarantee?
So I always ask the question, what is the use of the next level of bureaucracy, right? So you asked that we put another regulation to ask people to provide information.
You think that usually the RTI will be another layer of bureaucracy?
Yeah, it is. It definitely is. And you want to look at how ordinary citizens are able to scale the current levels of bureaucracy. So, for example, I have some entitlements if I go to hospital that I should be treated in a certain way. Even our students that are in the university, you are required to be treated in a certain way. And there are a lot of guarantees that we have. How many of those? If the police pick you up on the street, they are supposed to respect your right and to behave in a certain way. How much of that do we get? So when you are asking for another layer, then you want to ask yourself, what are we going to get? And that doesn't surprise me.
What are your fears exactly?
Well, I don't really fear anything. I just think that we haven't built a society that is able to take what belongs to it And therefore, asking that we have a right to information, and I to be very honest with you, I think that the politicians' fear are actually unfounded, because really, a lot of people in Ghana will not be able to take advantage of that law to ask for anything. There will just be a handful of people.
You don't have high expectations of the citizens of this country when it comes to taking advantage of an important provision like the right to information?
Let me just be very blunt with you. I think that the use of mobile phones in the workplace of people who are not allowed to have access to some information, to scan a document or even pick a document and put it on WhatsApp, is, in my view, more effective than having a right to information. Because you see, what is going to be the case is that many of us do not know how we are going to be able to address it. Of course, that does not say we should not have it. Because even if we're getting 1% of Ghanaians asking for information, they will be asking for very critical information, especially information that matters a lot, sometimes to national interest and national security stuff and all of that. So I agree. And for me, that is why I have a problem with the various political parties, and I will be completely disappointed if if our current president doesn't make sure that this law is passed. Because you see, the advocacy about fighting corruption, and I have said there hasn't been any fight, I haven't seen any yet. Maybe Amidu will come with it. The Amidu's office, the Special Prosecutor's office, and people's ability to be able to provide information, it's all boxed up in this cocktail of very complex things that it will be very difficult for us to be able to work ahead if we don't have this. So for me, I want the president to call his members of parliament, his party people to order, and give them a mandate and say, look, I want this passed in a month or two, and you see it will be done. Because we can pass laws in 48 hours to get people deported and stuff like that. Why can't we do this? We can do that. The second thing I would want us to do is not just so we get a law, and the next layer is to get people conscientized on how they can take advantage of the law. And I agree that the media has a significant role, but also that citizen groups like our brothers' organization and non-profit organizations should push the agenda to make sure that citizens get to understand what kind of information they can ask for, and so officers also know what kind of information they will provide and within what time frame they should provide that. Otherwise, we are just adding another layer of bureaucracy, and it may not just be helpful.
It may not just be helpful. Dr. Eric Odrosa, I know that this week Asibit and Abuga Pele have been thrown into prison for their involvement in some corruption practices, and the narrative started changing when the special prosecutor was sworn in. People have been asking, perhaps if he was in office, would he have been the one to handle such a case like that of Abuga Pele and Asibit? But the question I want to ask on the back of that is, to what extent will a right to information law make the work of the special prosecutor any better?
To the extent that you have access to relevant, reliable, and credible information. Because if you want to prosecute, you prosecute to secure conviction. And to be able to prosecute to secure conviction, the evidence must be relevant and reliable, and you thrive on information. So if you don't get the relevant information, which can be proved without reasonable doubt.
So you're saying the right information
is critical, because there have been instances where people have rushed to the court that we have information, there is corrupt activity, or there are corrupt activity, want to prosecute, and then they've been left off the hook. I'm a lawyer, and I can tell you that the standard for the prosecutor is so high that you have to prove your case beyond reasonable doubt. All that the defense will have to raise is raise a reasonable doubt in the standard you've provided. So that it makes it very difficult. So if you are going to court without credible information, it's critical. You can't prosecute anything. And I think that is what we are lacking. In the past, we've gone to court and left people off the hook. This time around, let us pass the RTI into a law. Let us make sure people come up with credible information. That's why I agree with my colleagues that the parameters within which information must be gathered, the kinds of information that can support successful prosecution to secure conviction is very important. So if the provisions in that particular act is very important and helps that in that regard, it will help.
But we also have to keep an eye on the layer of bureaucracy Professor Bawale talks about.
Well, I have told you that what is it that the RTI is coming to do that the Whistleblowers Act has not been able to do? What is it that we've not been able to do? Except that I take consolation in the fact that there is a constitutional provision that guarantees the right for people to have information. And I see the Right to Information bill or act being operationalization of that provision. However, once it is operationalized, we should come up with the parameters that will support successful prosecution.
Let me just add this. One of the things I am happy about this bill getting passed is the responsibility it will also place on institutions. We have, I think our record management is quite problematic. And you get, I'm told, I'm not sure how true this is, that a certain doctor says a certain data that I have about a certain public figure have been stolen from me.
From my house. Yeah.
And I asked the question, why would a medical facility, for God's sake, allow a medical doctor to keep information with him?
Information of public relevance.
Yes. Why would they? So this act.
That's the doctor who performed the autopsy on.
Because this is public records and it should be within the facility. So the medical director of that facility will be someone to provide that information, and you would have no cause to say, I can't find it because it is with the officer who did the job. Sorry.
So you're saying that whilst we're championing for the right to information law, we should also be taking care of the systems that protect the information.
Because what would happen is that if anything were happening in this place, and you know that somebody can demand it, and it will be legal,
and demand, then you don't have
you would be in trouble. You would make sure the information is available. And for me, that's one of the things that I am excited about this, that agencies, state agencies would be, and even private entities would be under obligation to make sure you keep information in such a way that if it's been demanded for, you can provide. And if we can get that, then you are sure that people won't come out and tell you the docket is missing. The docket is missing. The officer who is responsible, not the officer that did the job, but the responsible officer, the head of the institution, would have the responsibility to provide that. And so there will be a certain reawakening within the public service that information is not for me, but it is for the state, and that I have to protect it in such a way that when it's been looked for, we can find it.
Dr. Rashid Dramani, I want to ask you a very critical question before I shift for Dr. Eric Odrosai to wrap up. With or without the Right to Information Bill, the Special Prosecutor's Office is here now. Does it change anything at all in the dynamics of the fight against corruption in this country?
Yeah, it certainly does. I mean, and I'll tell you a very short story. A few years ago, when we were working with the Public Accounts Committee of Parliament, we said that we wanted to open up the PAC to the public. Today, you see the Public Accounts Committee holding its hearings in public. We wanted to achieve a few things. One is deterrence. Two is sanctions, and then the third one is making sure that administrative processes and so on are better in terms of record keeping and so on. We managed to achieve only the first one, that's deterrence. Today, if you ask public officials, I mean, in 2007, many public officials will say when they appear before the PAC that, oh, the minister took the money and then he didn't sign. The senior official took the impress, he didn't sign. But when it comes to the PAC, it's the spending officer who shows up. And most of them have said to us in private that the biggest embarrassment is when their children are in school and then they see their friends see their fathers appearing before the PAC, being grilled by members of parliament that they have done something wrong and so on. The Office of the Special Prosecutor, if it won't do anything at all, I think this deterrence is going to be very critical. But I want to go back to the issue of the freedom of information. And I think that, look, like I said earlier, just having that law alone is not going to be a panacea to our fight against corruption. I mean, there's going to be a cocktail of many things that need to be done.
Right.
And one of them, I think, is the reform of our public service, because these are the people who are going to be at the forefront of providing this information.
Right, Dr. Rashid, I'm sorry, we ran out of time. I wanted to give Dr. Eric Odrosai a closer remark, but we just have about 20 or 30 seconds.
Well, I think we have to just be proactive and then revise our National Anti-Corruption Action Plan so that we'll be able to fight corruption well. That's what I can say.
Right. Thank you very much, everyone, for making time to be with us here on Agenda. And thanks to Professor Justice Bawley and Dr. Eric Odrosai and Dr. Rashid Dramani, who also graced the stage today and made the discussion interesting. Thank you for staying. Have a good afternoon.